Good morning. My name is Dayna Killian. I'm a PhD student here at Waterford Institute of Technology. My research is focused on the spatial representation of women in plays by women, which were produced by the Abbey Theatre and its predecessors prior to 1951. Focusing primarily on Katie Roche, but referring to a selection of Teresa Deevy's plays, this paper will argue that Deevy uses space to critically highlight the ways in which the Church and State restricted the movement of female bodies in the Irish Free State in an attempt to shape those bodies into a Catholic nationalist ideal of Irish womanhood. It will discuss Deevy's depiction of women protagonists who, like Katie Roche, are encouraged, influenced, forced and coerced to resolve their ambition to find something great to do within the limits of what was possible for women, in particular poor and so-called illegitimate women, in Irish society during this period, in order that they might better conform to this ideal. The disparity between the aspirations of a young Irish woman and what was possible for women to achieve in Irish society is a dichotomy which is central to Deevy's work. As Kealy states, Deevy highlights the ways that women's vision, energy and potential are stymied by the limited life paths available to them. In Katie Roche, the central protagonist is Katie, a young woman whose mother, Mary Hanlon, was unmarried and is now supposedly dead. And as a consequence, Katie was raised by Mrs. Roche. The entire action of the three-act play takes place in the living room of Amelia Gregg, where Katie now works as a domestic servant. The opening stage directions describe the physical details of the empty room and of Stanislaus Gregg, Amelia's brother, who enters from outside the cottage through the slightly ajar door positioned centre back. This is juxtaposed with a description of Katie, who subsequently enters from another room in the house. Apart from her age, not quite 20, the stage directions do not focus on Katie's outward physicality. Instead, they state, "Perhaps the most remarkable thing about her is a sort of inward glow." Thus, Katie is immediately represented with a vitality which contrasts with the ordinariness of the dramatic world, the realistic cottage setting. And it is this conflict which provides the dramatic action of the play, as Katie struggles to negotiate a way out of this world, a world in which she does not belong. This incongruity between an everyday setting and what Niamh Coyne calls the striking presence of a young heroine is central to Deevy's earlier Abbey plays, A Disciple in 1931 and The King of Spain's Daughter in 1935, as well as Wife to James Whelan, which was rejected by the Abbey in 1942. Although Deevy's plays are not strictly realistic, Deevy, like Abbey playwrights Margaret O'Leary and later Una Troy, chose realistic Irish settings. Deevy thus harnessed the potential of realism to do what Patricia Schroeder describes, which is to use realism to depict both a woman's entrapment and her contrary desires. Despite the arguments that feminism and realism are not compatible, Schroeder maintains that depicting a repressive reality is not the same as endorsing it. Such a depiction can also be used to expose the unjust power relations that make it possible. This is the case with Deevy's work. Deevy's decision to position women whose vitality, physicality and unique worldview marks them as extraordinary within ordinary, realistic Irish settings highlights the oppressive daily regime women experienced as citizens of the Irish Free State. What is more, the protagonist's nonconformity and resistance to societal norms which dictate the position of women in Irish society emphasises the incongruity between the limited roles available to women in the so-called everyday or real world and the protagonist's dreams of lives and possibilities which transcended the lived reality of the majority of Irish women. Here it is necessary to briefly discuss what was possible for women in the initial decades after the establishment of the Irish Free State. Katrina Beaumont states that it was the image of the ideal Irish woman, the wife and mother, which predominated in Irish society. During the 1920s and 1930s, the state introduced legislation which actively directed female bodies towards the domestic space to fulfil these roles of wives and mothers. This legislation included the Juries Bills in 1924 and 1927, which excluded women from jury service with the option to opt in, and legislation which limited women's access to the labour force, such as the 1924 Civil Service Regulation Act, which prohibited women from working in the civil service once they married, and which was expanded in 1932 to include primary school teachers. And this so-called marriage bar was also widely implemented in the private sector. This legislation restricted women's visibility in public spaces and narrowed the scope of their participation and contribution to Irish society, as well as preventing women from becoming economically independent. The introduction of the Censorship Act in 1929 prevented the distribution of any material which provided information on birth control or abortion. Legislation which prevented women from making decisions about family planning, their bodies and their futures. This legislation reflected and endorsed the teachings of the Church, which viewed the role of women in society to be domestic and familial, as stated in the Rerum Novarum. As Dayna Killian states, throughout the first half of the 1930s, a corpus of legislation passed by the Cumann na Gael-led government explicitly framed Catholic priorities and misogynies within articles of Irish law, restricting what was legal to read, to discuss and experience. Thus, the legislation introduced at this time was a direct attempt by both state and church to direct female bodies and dictate the roles and positions of women within the new social space of the Irish Free State. Katie Roche was produced by the Abbey in 1936, at a time when the new constitution of the Irish Free State was in the process of being drafted. Melissa Sierra states that the mutually reinforcing ideologies of the Catholic Church and Irish Free State became embedded in Eamon de Valera's Oireachtas bills. For example, Act 41 of the Constitution states, "The state recognises that by her life within the home, woman gives to the state a support without which the common good cannot be achieved." As a result, in 1937, women's place within the home was constitutionalised, and as Shona Hill surmises, the home as a space in which to contain women was bolstered by restrictive legal and ideological frameworks enshrined by the government of Eamon de Valera. Simone de Beauvoir famously asserts that one is not born but rather becomes a woman. In Ireland, the general consensus of a society which was heavily indoctrinated by Catholic and nationalist ideologies was that this so-called becoming entailed marriage and motherhood, and active measures were undertaken by church and state to ensure that female bodies remained within the home, in order that they might fulfil what de Beauvoir refers to as this vocation. Becoming an Irish woman, then, was not a biologically determined and naturally occurring result of being born female. Rather, Irish womanhood was a carefully constructed identity which tightly encompassed marriage, motherhood, and a place within the home. Judith Butler asks her reader to consider gender as a corporeal style, an act, as it were, and thus argues that in society, gender roles are constructs which bodies perform and produce through the repetition of a series of actions. In reference to this, Elaine Diamond states that performance is the site in which performativity materializes in concentrated form. Because of this connection, playwrights may, and do, choose to comment on the construction of gender roles in wider society by drawing an audience's attention to the fact that the characters in the play are artificial constructions. In Deevy's In the Cellar of My Friend, Patty self-reflexively states, "Certain parts are marked out for us, as I see it." In this way, Deevy interrupts the realistic aesthetic to comment on the artifice of constructed gender roles. Her use of meta-theatre reminds the audience that the character of Patty is a pre-written part. What is more, when Patty's statement is read in the context of Deevy's oeuvre, it can be seen to apply to the recurrence of older women characters in plays such as A Disciple, The King of Spain's Daughter, and Katie Roche. These older women in Deevy's plays are stereotypical in that they passively accept or actively enforce the status quo, and are content or resigned to the lack of possibilities available to them as women in Irish society. For instance, in Katie Roche, Amelia passively accepts nearly all the decisions suggested by Stan. Margaret Drybone, the ever-critical third Greg sibling, states, Amelia would never think or dream. The repetition of this character type and Deevy's signatory use of a realistic Irish setting comments upon the normalising effect of Irish society on the female body and the ways in which these bodies are shaped into compliant subjects. These older women characters provide a counterpoint to the younger protagonist's dissatisfaction. They represent what the younger women may eventually become, and conversely, the younger women characters suggest that these compliant subjects may not always have been so compliant. This dynamic in Deevy's plays reflects the relationship between Mrs. O'Hara and Ellen Dunn in Margaret O'Leary's play The Woman, which was produced by the Abbey in 1929. In The Woman, Ellen interrogates Mrs. O'Hara, incredulously questioning her apparent contentment with her domestic role in the home. Ellen confronts Mrs. O'Hara and exclaims, "And were you like that always?" In response, Mrs. O'Hara states, "Well, when I was a young girl, I used to be a bit fidgety, like all young girls, wanting love and romance and all sorts of foolish things. But sure, I learned sense with the years." Mrs. O'Hara thus shows that she became satisfied with her place in life as part of a gradual process, and explains that she underwent a transition over time. She identifies the reason for this change as everything. Similarly, the prevalence of the younger woman, older woman relationship in Deevy's plays suggests that while the younger woman may currently resist conformity to a predefined role, this resistance may not withstand the wide variety of unrelenting ways in which a female body is pressured to eventually accept their role in the Irish Free State. As Kealy states, over the course of her 1930s plays, Deevy traces a progressive diminishment in her heroines' ability to articulate their resistance and a growing bodily docility. Foucault names the prevalent forces which influence and shape the behaviours and attitudes of bodies in this way as disciplinary techniques. In the Irish Free State, these disciplinary techniques were some of the ways in which, as Kealy states, restrictive social and religious orthodoxies corralled women and men into reduced ways of being. Michel Foucault states that the control of space is a central part of the disciplinary process, which creates useful subjects or docile bodies, who are easily controlled and manipulated, and that the supervision and micromanagement of a body's time and movement within a confined and useful space effectively produces automata. Foucault argues that an easily pliable body is potentially useful, and that in society, disciplinary techniques ensure that, as a body becomes more obedient, it also becomes more useful, and conversely, the more useful a body becomes, the more obedient it becomes. As seen in the Irish Free State, the support that women were expected to provide to the state by their lives within the home was predominantly in their role as mothers. This was because both the church and state recognised the hugely influential role a mother plays in a child's life, and sought to harness that control in order to propagate nationalist Catholic ideologies onto impressionable young minds. In the Irish Free State, the ideal Irish woman was a docile body, who both passively adhered to the status quo and who actively worked to perpetuate Catholic and nationalist ideologies in their powerful position as mothers. The home was thus a disciplinary space for both women and their children, the future Irish adult population who were in their care. Amelia lived all her life in the cottage. As Stanislaus notes, "You've grown old in the house where you were once young." Amelia's stasis within the home contrasts with Katie's unpredictability, demonstrated by Katie's interaction with and resistance against the boundary walls. For instance, in Act 1, Katie ineffectually tries to make room for herself to look out the window, as Stanislaus blocks her view. In this instance, Stan passively blocks Katie's ability to see a world outside of the cottage. At the end of Act 1, Katie agrees to marry Stan. In his role as husband, he adopts a more active role in his control of Katie and explicitly prohibits Katie from stopping out in the night. Thus, as a wife rather than as a servant, Kealy becomes more tightly imprisoned within the home, and Michael, an old boyfriend, states, "There's no holiday for you out of it," i.e. the house, "now. You were better off before." As Anthony Roche states, the house is what she is married into. Thus, as Stan's wife, Kealy forfeits even the limited autonomy she had as a domestic servant, and her life is now completely bound within the cottage walls. The Gregg cottage is thus depicted as a disciplinary space. Amelia's long-term stay within it has increased her docility, and it can be expected that if Kealy were to remain within the cottage walls for long enough, she too would become like Amelia. At the play's conclusion, Stan takes Kealy away from the cottage in order that she might be more carefully kept under surveillance. At the Abbey, playwrights such as J.M. Singh, Margaret O'Leary and Una Troy represent the home as a physically constrictive space for their women protagonists, one which they yearn to escape. Conversely, while Deevy too represents the home as a constrictive space, at the play's conclusion, Kealy Roche does not want to leave the cottage and the surrounding village. She states, "What would I do away from this place? I that have lived all my life here, when you'd go off and leave me." As Anthony Roche states, Deevy's ending resists the romantic allure of away. Away for Kealy is not a means of escape. Instead, she predicts that it will result in an increased level of surveillance and loneliness. Thus, marriage is represented as a relationship or space within which a woman's movements are closely surveyed and censored, regardless of the physical space she may inhabit. Deevy thus shows that the spaces which constrict women are ideological as well as physical and cannot be simply evaded by leaving the home. Stephen Murray states that Deevy had an unfailing recognition of the eventual supremacy of reality over fantasy or romance. Thus, while Deevy's heroines might dream and fantasize about alternative worlds, in both her offstage and onstage spaces, Deevy represents a reality which offers no promise or chance of escape for young Irish women. This paper has explored some of the ways in which Deevy uses on and offstage spaces to highlight the ways in which, in the Irish Free State, female bodies were directed towards the home, in an attempt to shape those bodies into women subjects who are both compliant and useful to the state as wives and mothers. My chapter on Deevy in my PhD expands on this analysis of space to consider how Deevy represents the disciplinary spaces, both institutional and domestic, in the Irish Free State in relation to those Irish women who were either not mothers or who were considered to be the wrong kind of mothers. Thank you very much for listening.